So I would like to welcome all of you to the Stockbridge Library Museum and Archives Narrative Medicine series. And this idea came from Dr. Owen Lewis, who had this fantastic idea of marrying National Poetry Month with this series. So each Thursday night in April, we will have a reading from a poet, and we'll explore the concept of narrative medicine. So I would like to turn the program over to Owen and to the poet joining us tonight, Kate Daniels. Just a little bit about Kate. She's the author of 6 collections of poetry, and most recently, the title, In the Months of My Son's Recovery. And she is the Edwin Mims Professor of English at Vanderbilt University, where she also teaches in the Medicine, Health, and Society program. Kate is the former poet in residence at Duke Medical Center and Vanderbilt Medical Center, and she's on the writing faculty of the Washington-Baltimore Center for Psychoanalysis. And she is joining us this evening from Nashville. Welcome, Kate, and Owen, welcome and thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. I was really honored to read on the regular poetry series of the library called Poetry Medicine for the Soul. I think I read it in October for my new book, Field Light. And that the name of the series kept turning in my mind, and I thought, well, yes, poetry is medicine for the soul, and we can even do one better than that. Medicine and poetry is really quite a burgeoning field in the what we call now narrative medicine. And I wanted to say a few words about that and ask Kate to say a few words, because Kate, as you heard from her bio, has been involved in bringing medicine to, or bringing poetry into the medical center and using it. Dan Becker, who will be the last poet in this series, also works in the area of narrative medicine in Charlottesville, Virginia. And, it really comes about because of really the pace of medicine today, electronic medicine, records, and doctors simply not having time to really get at the story of their patients, of the illness, and really becoming disconnected from their own stories of healing. And so narrative medicine broadly refers to any reading or writing about illness and healing. And my particular involvement, I teach at Columbia, particularly with medical students, and it helps to instill a certain sensibility through the words, but also a capacity to listen, which I think is so missing from today's medical education, which is why we sort of come in the back door. Kate, you've been involved for many, many years with medical centers. Do you want to say a few words before we get into the content of today's
Sure.
reading?
First, thanks for inviting me, Stockbridge Library, Wendy and Owen. I'm glad to be here. And thank you all for coming at the cocktail hour. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about addiction and recovery and poetry in a minute. I got into this probably accidentally back in the 1970s after I graduated with my BA in English in 1975 with no prospects from the University of Virginia. I stuck around Charlottesville, so I didn't know what else to do. And I took an easily available job, which was working as what was then called a nurse's aide at the medical center there. And it was, the labor, very close sort of body work with patients, changing bedpans, changing sheets, that sort of thing. And I did it just to have a job. I was already writing poetry very seriously at that point. I was also writing fiction, but what happened to me immediately was I was just gripped by the experience. And over the next 15 years, as I completed my graduate education and then started in my academic teaching career and began to write and publish books, I, at some point, I would say the late 80s, became aware of the fact that these experiences that I had had with patients and also with providers, but mostly it was the experiences with patients, would not leave me, and that they were in many ways very deeply inscribed in me. And so I began to write about them and out of that place. That coincided with moving to Durham, North Carolina with my family. And I was actually approached at that point by a group there, which is now called the Osler Literary Roundtable after William Osler. But I forget, it was at the time, it was a reading and writing group for anyone in the medical center who wanted to get together and, you know, with shared literary interests. They called themselves, I Want to Write You a Poem. That was the group at what it was called at that time. And they asked me if I would consider becoming the poet in residence at Duke Medical. So I did that. It was 8 hours a week, $15 an hour. And I was completely, at that point, sort of mentored into the field and fell in love with it. I teach in an area called Health Humanities now in Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt. I've done a lot of different kinds of work in it. I don't teach narrative medicine myself. We do offer classes in it at Vanderbilt, but I do guest sessions in it. And I write very much out of that sort of confluence, I guess, of interests and urgencies, really. Is that the kind of thing you wanted me to say, Owen?
Well, sure. That's great.
So that, I mean, I see narrative medicine in particular as one of the reasons it interests me is that it what shall we say? It shifted the emphasis in healthcare from the physician to the patient. It began to privilege, you know, the patient in a new kind of way, precisely because of these humanities-based tools or teaching methods, I guess we could call them. Reading literature, talking about literature, writing. These are the tools, the interpretative things that we do in the humanities, and applying them to medical care starting in the training of physicians during the 1980s seemed to be a really excellent and productive thing to do. That period coincided, obviously, with a period in which the training of physicians was becoming more and more feminized, to use the term. More and more women were beginning to attend medical school, be allowed to attend medical school. My old baby boomer feminist self has to editorially insert. And also coincided with the period in which there were tremendous early advances in biomedical technology beginning to be made, which was excellent for healthcare, but maybe not so excellent for the old bedside manner. So it seems to have sprung up in response to a number of different stimuli from society at large.
So thank you, Kate. That sort of broadly sort of talks about what we're doing. The structure of this series is going to be focusing on 5 different topics. And, you know, I think that there are 2 things that we get from narrative medicine. One is the whole process of connecting with patients, with ourselves, around the stories. But then there are things that are told in narrative medicine in general, in poetry, that you're not going to read in the textbooks, and aspects of the entities that we're dealing with. Is, I think the advantage of narrative medicine is that it talks about the human dilemma, not the illness always, although the illness is there. So today's topic is going to be addiction and recovery. Next week we'll do addiction and loss. Then we're going to move on to parenting, parenting autistic children, 2 poets who write on that topic. Then on cancer, hope and recovery. And then Dan is going to reflect on a life in medicine and poetry. So Kate's book, In the Month of My Son's Recovery, this is her latest book. It's in the Stockbridge Library. Kate, where do we begin with this? Do you want to tell us a little bit about this book, how you came to write it? And then I have some questions, a few other things I wanted to ask you about. And then, of course, we're going to hear poet's words directly.
How did I come to write it? So it is an autobiographical book, but it's not perfectly and totally autobiographical. I think I put a note to readers at the beginning. These poems are narrated by a character similar but not identical to myself, and represent other characters and situations that may be archetypal, emanating from many aspects of and perspectives on the current opioid epidemic. So I'm read these poems and talk about this with the permission of all of my family members whose experiences were part of my experience, and they all read the poems beforehand and have given me permission to read them and talk about them to people. Like so many American families, my family was affected by the opioid epidemic. One of my children, while in college, was revealed to be addicted to both alcohol and to opioids, starting with abuse of prescription medication. Actually, this is a case of dual diagnosis, if you know what that is, co-occurring mental illness and addiction. So abuse of prescribed medications for bipolar 1. And then that moved into opioids, prescribed opioids, and then into heroin. And so that's the genesis of the book. I write autobiographically. I've always written out of my own experience. For a long time, I thought I would not be able to write about this because it was so terrifying and traumatizing and shocking and shameful. It felt very shameful to me it felt like a failure, a very personal failure, that I had failed as a mother. I failed as a parent, as an educator. We're supposed to do better than this. So for a long time, I thought I would not write about it, but ultimately I had to, because that's what I do. I write poems and I write about my experiences in order to learn about them, to gain some control over them, to share them with others, to create aesthetic literary objects that may have some value and hopefully some meaning for other people who have an interest in or connection to them. That's where it comes from.
In reading through Kate's book again, one of the poems that I keep coming back to, and maybe I'll say a few words about it. Maybe you would read this now, and then we'll talk some more, and then you can, we'll let you read at length. But the thing that I learned, and has been, I think this is an eye-opener for every student. The poem called The Addict's Mother Birth Story. And, one of the things that medical students are socialized into is this AA notion: don't be an enabler, don't be an enabler. And, that's such a simple phrase. And, nobody really explains it in textbooks. Nobody really gets underneath that concept. And if you want to know what narrative medicine does, I think this story, The Addict's Mother Birth Story, just turns this whole notion of being an enabler and what is the human dimension of that. And do you want to say anything about the poem and maybe just read it for us right off the bat, Kate?
Yeah, you want me to say a few words before I read it?
Yeah.
So I was taken when almost as immediately, I would say within 24 hours of receiving this shocking news about my child. I was taken by a friend who had been a longtime member of Al-Anon, which some of you may know is a 12-step based support group for the families and friends of people who who are suffering with what the medical profession calls substance use disorder. And this became extremely important to me. I mean, if without that, there wouldn't be this book. There might be a lot of poems I'd written that I saved, for myself and never showed anyone, but the book wouldn't have existed. And one of the things that happened as soon as I went, despite the fact that I think I just sat in the meetings and cried for the first 2 months, was that I began to experience the site as a site of narrative making and narrative sharing. If you've ever been to one of these meetings, or if you've seen a representation of it on TV or in a movie, you know that it's highly structured in certain ways and completely free in others. So people share stories of the addiction or stories that relate to the 12-step process, but they have only a very limited amount of time. In most groups, it's 3 minutes. And a person shares, and then there can be nothing that's called crosstalk. No one can say, oh, you poor thing. No one can say, I know what you should do. No one can say, let me refer you to, this treatment center. You have to be totally, each one is cut off and presented. And then another person talks and they share. So it's very much, I used to say to myself, I've told Owen and Danny both this, that it's like a weird combination of an old time psychoanalysis session where you're with a very silent analyst who says nothing. And so you're just hearing your own, production. But at the same time, it's kind of like a Quaker meeting. If you've ever been to a Quaker meeting where you worship in this really intense, almost sort of sacred space that's very alone. There's all these people in the room with you. You're aware of them, but you don't talk to them, and it's not like going to other types of Protestant churches, for instance. So it was very much like that. And that was extremely imaginatively productive to me. It allowed me to back up from my experience. And instead of just hearing the platitudes of 12-step, enabling, let go and let God, you need to detach, all those kinds of things, I began to sort of be able to see my situation in a literary context, to tell you the truth. I experienced myself as a kind of a character. So some of these poems are written in the first person, and some of them are written in the third person. And this particular one is written in the third person. It's the second one in the sequence. It was one of the earliest poems I wrote. And it does come out of the experience of beginning to see, almost like a light bulb came on, exactly what these 12-step means when they talk about enabling as a well-meaning but destructive both behavior and psychological dynamic that we often see parents and spouses enacting with regard to their loved ones who are suffering from addictions. The addict's mother birth story. She wasn't watching when they cut him out. C-section, green drape obscuring the mound of ripened belly they extracted him from. He spilled out squalling, already starving. Still stitching her up, they fastened him to her breast so he could feed. There, he rooted for the milk, so lustful in his sucking that weeping roses grew from the edges of her nipples. For weeks they festered there, blooming bloody trails anew each and every time he made a meal of her. I know what you're thinking, but he was her child. She had to let him do that to her. So I guess at the end of that poem, when the narrator interrupts and starts talking directly to the audience, I know what you're thinking, she says, well, not the narrator's third person omniscient narration, but she breaks that and speaks to the audience. I think I was trying to replicate poetically some of that sense of shock when a new awareness came upon me about the experience that I was trapped inside. And that became a kind of an opening, a way to see a possible way out of it, if that makes sense. And that's narrative medicine. I mean, that's one of the things that as Owen said, it's capable of doing.
But this poem breaks my heart every time I read it, see it. And I'm telling you, this is, if the medical students who are working with in addictions medicine understand one thing, I think this so expands the complexity of um, the stereotypes that they bring to the situation. Um, Kate, I wanted to just talk about two other poems in this, and then we're going to let you read it a bit. Um, you know, there's a poem in the middle of the book called "Reading a Biography of Thomas Jefferson in the Months of My Son's Recovery," and I thought, God, what is that doing here in the middle? And um, what two things occurred to me. One is that when you are so deep into your own angst and your own suffering, you see your story in anything, even the biography of Thomas Jefferson. So as Kate picks through aspects of the story, she's seeing parts of her own dilemma. It so works. It's quite magical. And I don't know if that's what you were thinking, Kate, but that's what I took from it. And then it's many sections, and then towards the end of the penultimate section, I just want to read the last 3 lines, or last 4 lines. Of all those interwoven pavers, someone baked from clay, carted there, laid out by hand, brick by brick by brick, I carved a small sanity where I could rest, and read. It's just wonderful about being in the midst of one's suffering and finding relief from it. Did you want to say anything about this poem?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's like I was reading a biography of Thomas Jefferson in the very first months when this episode of my life unfolded. I had been commissioned to write a poem for an anthology of poems about Thomas Jefferson and Monticello. As I said, I went to undergraduate school at UVA. I lived there, then I did a master's degree there. Then I went off and finished my graduate education, and then they hired me back to teach. And so it's a place that's very important to me. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college. And so it represented all of that stuff. When I went into college in 1971, there was still quite an idealization of Thomas Jefferson happening. There was still not even any recognition of Sally Hemings and her children that were fathered by him. Monticello was still denying that. And I was very caught in, I admired Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, as the writer of the Declaration of Independence, and for many other reasons, as the founder of the university, as the builder, the creative genius of Monticello. But I also was pretty clear about, problems, serious problems, more than problems. And so I wanted to write a poem that would somehow include those aspects without it just being a poem of, political invective. How do I do that? How do I suggest something about my feelings about this person, this historical figure these feelings that are deeply complicated? So as I was researching by reading biographies and making notes and thinking, and I began to think of the kind of ways in which so much of his personality seemed to be a performance of certain types of grandiosity. I mean, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, my God, what kind of a weird visionary did you have to be be able to figure out that you should buy a couple million acres of swamps down in Louisiana in 1802? And yet he did it, and what an amazing difference it made. But then there were these other things. And so at some point, what happened to me was that as I began thinking more about my child's bipolar and educating myself about bipolar and about its deep connection with addiction, I began to think about the split in my child's, what do we say, psyche, brain, and also some kind of a split in Thomas Jefferson. And that was where the poem came from. So it was an attempt to try to put all these pieces together that don't fit, that shouldn't fit, but that just were there to be reckoned with in a way.
So look, let's many other things I could ask you about, but let's hear what you want to read from In the Months of My Son's Recovery, and leave at least 5 minutes at the end for people here to ask you some questions.
Okay, so read about 15 or 20 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, good 20. Yeah, I think we.
Okay,
Wait.
all right. I have some of these poems on a PowerPoint. People want to see them as I read them? Yes?
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Can I share my screen?
Oh, Wendy, can you give her permission? Yeah.
Okay. All right. Take me a second. I've been Zooming all day, so I'm a little tired.
Why stop now?
That's right. You're right. Okay, let me go back to there. Okay. This is the first poem in this entire sequence. It's one of the earliest ones that I wrote. And I wrote it again to try to distance myself from my situation and to try to understand that I was trapped in something that, as much as it was tearing me up and destroying me, was much larger than myself. And that if I only focused on myself, that wasn't going to be a very productive way to deal with it. This is called In the Midst of the Heroin Epidemic. When I heard the news that Cynthia's daughter had died all alone, slumped over on the ground beside a dumpster behind the convenience store where she'd made her final buy, I logged off and walked outside to look at the water before I could think too much. It's become a habit now, losing myself in the soothing image of moving water before the headlines and the stats start blaring out the way they do, performing themselves inside my mind that has always imagined too vividly too much. You think too much, my parents always said, but thinking about this or not thinking won't reverse the events that have captured Cynthia or bring back the daughter who's been carried away in an opening chapter of a terrible plot. Addicts destroy themselves. That's just where we start. And why they might have wanted to, or if it was an accident, is beside the point. The aftermath is what's at stake. The human flotsam captured in addiction's filthy wake. Ordinary citizens like Cynthia, with her stone face and her dead blue eyes. Single mother of one child, deceased. She works at the bakery down the block from me. I pay her for a cappuccino and a buttered roll every morning on my way to work. Afterwards, I linger on the wooden pier and drown my eyes in the river's watery embrace and lick butter from my fingers and fill my head with the strong smell of hot coffee Cynthia poured for me. Small actions that distract. They minimize but can't efface any of the suffering. One of the lessons, I guess, for me from all of this was the absolute necessity of community and connecting with others. I think that that's the sense of community in healthcare facilities, particularly in large medical centers, which is, as I said, where I went to work right out of my undergraduate school, is something that has always deeply appealed to me. I'm not quite sure, a lot of people are terrified of medical centers, hospitals, don't like to go near them at all, but I find them very comforting. And I can remember very strongly walking into the part of the old hospital at UVA where I had to enter to go to work, 40, almost 50 years, 45 years ago, and feeling as I walked through the doors that I was leaving one world and entering another, and that I was part of this world. And it was a very, in many ways, difficult and challenging world, but it was a world that was prepared to deal with, honestly and straightforwardly, with challenges, tragedies. It was a happy place too. Babies were born there, people got well there, but it was a very honest sort of setting that appealed to me. And so, but at the same time, like a lot of writers, I'll say like almost all writers and maybe almost all artists, I'm a incredible introvert. And in certain ways, kind of a hermit. I mean, I think too much. I'm in my head too much. But this kind of a real life problem does not respond well to isolation and cutting oneself off from others. That, quickly leads to shame and shaming. And so it was essential to me that through the Al-Anon group that I went to, which is a group of women that's been around since the 1970s, it's women only, that I began to experience myself not just as alone, but as part of something much larger than myself. So I'm going to come back to this one. So I'm going to read this poem, this next poem I'm going to read, because I wrote just dozens of these poems. This is my favorite poem that I wrote out of the whole thing. It's the least poetic. It's probably the most raw, certainly the most rude, one of the most rude. It's got the F word in it, but if you can't say the F word in a public library, where the heck can you say it? In a public library in the United States of America. So that's a trigger warning for people who are upset by it. And it is an attempt to say something about what I was talking about earlier, about the ways in which my imagination and my decades of experience in the classroom teaching literature just recognize something in the structure of 12-step support group meetings that was helpful to me and allowed me to use my tools, as a writer and as a literature professor, to begin to reframe what I considered my tragedy, my family's tragedy, and to figure out how I was going to find a way out of this. So this poem refers to a couple of things. It uses the phrase "in the rooms," which just means in a 12-step room. And it refers somewhat obliquely to the very first step of the 12 steps, which is the really famous one. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and drugs. And a final thing I'll say is, I told you that when people are sharing their narratives, they only have a certain amount of time. And most, particularly Al-Anon groups, are very intense about this. And so when your 3 minutes is off, when it's finished, if you haven't stopped talking, then there's a timer that goes off. And some of these are very assertive. So that's referred to in here too. Support group. For a long time, each day was a bad day. Truthfully, for years, each day was a bad day. The nights were worse, but she could slide the deadbolt on the bedroom door and swallow an Ambien to summon sleep. Thank God she never dreamed about it. The meetings helped, but it was hard to go because the first thing you did was admit you were fucked and had no power. It was worse to stay home, sitting on the fear like a solitary hen hatching her eggs. There were a lot of rules and tissues in the room. The rules were followed. The tissues were dispensed to those who wept. In the rooms, there was infinite suffering. It had 3 minutes each to describe itself. A little timer went off, or someone waved a cardboard clock face in the air. One suffering stopped talking, and the next one started up. A lot of suffering in the world, That's the first thing most people think when they come here. I think I misquoted the end of that, but yeah, it's the first clear thought most people have when they come here. So there was something about, the containment and the way that time was handled and the ways in which each person's utterance was treated as a sort of a text, was presented as a kind of a text, that was just fantastically helpful to me. And again, I think this is part of what is the fuel that makes narrative medicine as successful and as energetic as it is. See what else I put on here. This is called detox. If you know anything about the whole sort of process of treatment of addiction in this country, you know that if you are lucky enough and your loved one is willing, the first thing you do is you get them into treatment. And the first thing they do in treatment is detox the person. Detox. So she wouldn't judge, she practiced empathy. Sitting for months in full lotus, palms open, thumb and forefinger touching to make a small circle, she could empty her thoughts inside until emptiness was all that filled her. To complete the ritual, she purified her body, deleting the nightly glass of Spanish red she savored while slicing, I'm sorry, there's a typo there, while slicing vegetables for dinner. Her medications, all prescribed, were next. The benzodiazepine she seldom took, trazodone to help her sleep, the antidepressant she swallowed every day. It surprised her how long they took to leave her body, how reluctantly they exited. They bothered her for weeks, waking her at night, throbbing through the lengthy spans of muscles, the quadriceps and gastrocnemius complaining as her system forced them out. It was harder than she'd thought, giving up her little pleasures, taking the shine off things she'd gotten used to polishing up at the end of the day to anesthetize their prick. Still, it wasn't all that difficult to shed those habits, and she barely noticed any difference until she saw him in the detox unit behind glass, lined up on a bench with all the other addicts and the drunks. They looked like convicts sitting side by side with their laceless sneakers and their beltless pants, locked in and shackled to beeping monitors and IV drips. She was clean herself by then, so nothing softened the blow or diluted the force of awful feelings that slammed up inside her chest when she saw that sight. She had to take it raw because she couldn't rush home anymore, as she would have done before, to calm herself with a soothing dose of Zoloft and Merlot. That was kind of one of the shocks of, having a family member go into treatment, and most treatment centers have sponsored these really excellent family programs where the entire family comes together, because one of the sort of main ideas about successful treatment of addiction in this country, which was first sort of developed in the early 1970s by the Hazleton treatment centers, is that addiction is a family problem. It's a family disease, a family illness. And so, these centers have developed these family programs which bring in all the relevant family members. So one of the things as you learn more and more about addiction is you kind of see, even though you think yourself, I don't have any problems, the reframing that takes place can help you see that, have a different perspective on your own habits. A very common part of this whole process is relapse, and these next two poems are about that. Metaphor less. The dryness, dead center of deep pain. The bone on bone grinding that goes on for months preceding the surgery. That's the way the parent whose child is using heroin again feels in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, standing at the bedroom window, looking out, just barely conscious of what the moon looks like, drained, gray. The moon is a popular literary image, solipsistic misery, misplaced love, whatever. Tonight, it's nothing but a switched on bulb swinging high up in the sky, shining its light on the bleakness inside and the bleakness outside that has no other meaning but the cold, uncrackable rock of itself. Relapse. Several of the young men from the treatment center are already dead. They spanned the demographic spectrum, so no conclusions can be made about why they did or didn't make it. They just went back to using. I remember their mothers from the family program where we gathered for a week to educate ourselves about addiction as disease and to learn to not enable and to practice letting go. We held hands and role played and chanted healing mantras and shared experience, strength, and hope. But in the restroom, we dropped our masks and wailed full blast and held each other and collapsed on the floor, showing cell phone images of our boys suited up for Little League and tumbling with their puppies. Like every other addict's mother, I have cried myself out, wrung dry and ground down by the grief and fear that fuels my weeping. The single lesson I have learned is this: a person can only feel so much. Eventually, affect overflows and loses shape as it escapes from its container. If the thing inside is hot, it scalds or scorches every part of us it touches. And if it's cold, it freezes. I'm going to read one actually that's it's not on the PowerPoint. It's called Recovery. Because the truth is, you know, one of the sort of submerged narratives of addiction in this country is that most people actually recover, and most people actually recover on their own. But we don't talk about that, you know, and that's not the story that gets in the media. This is called Recovery. Nothing's the same anymore now that the drinking has stopped and the drugs have been flushed from his system. Now that no one who lives here is snorting or shooting up or coming home deranged with craving or littering the bathroom with tiny bits of balled up tin foil blackened by flame. Despite the brand new quiet that forms a fragile skin, tranquility eludes. Something uneasy still moves beneath the surface of daily life. Tentative, nervous, I strive for rhythms that will make it right. In grade school, skipping rope, we girls rocked our bodies in staccato time with the turning ropes, trying to isolate the perfect moment we could jump inside without rupturing the pattern. It's like that now, I think. That's what I tell myself anyway, to keep my mind off how powerless I am and how I can't control what he's doing or where he is or who he's with or if he's back to using. Every time my mind jumps away from me like that, I do the next right thing. I bring it back. Ditto when I fail again. Ditto after that. And after that, ad infinitum. And then I'm going to read one more little short poem. Let's see if I have it on here. Yeah. So a big part of any 12-step program, whatever it's addressing, you know, substance abuse, substance-based addictions, or behavioral addictions, a huge central part of the idea is mindfulness, which is a very kind of Zen idea, and also has applications, as far as I'm concerned, to psychoanalysis too. So a big concept, particularly in Al-Anon, is that of detachment. If you can't detach, you can't stop enabling, you can't figure out the healthy ways to support your person who is trying to overcome substance use disorder. And it's a really hard thing to learn. It's probably a hard thing to learn. I mean, it's like how long did it take the Buddha to get enlightened, right? Like how many years was that? Decades to get where he got. Imagine how hard it is in this consumer-oriented, greedy, we deserve everything that we can get, society that we've built based on consumer capitalism, to convince ourselves to slow down, that we don't need anything, to be in the moment, to not think about what's happened in the past, to not worry about what's going to happen in the future. It's a very, very hard thing, and for anyone, but particularly, I think, for this kind of world that we live in, it's extremely countercultural. But that's what you have to do. At least that's what I found I had to do if I was going to get any peace and make some progress. And before I read this final poem, I should have said this at the beginning. My family member whose experience was the autobiographical origin of these poems is in fact in recovery, fairly long-term recovery at this point. And so part of the reason that I go around to so many places and read these poems and talk about them is to try to get this narrative out there, that addiction, substance use disorder is not necessarily a one-way road to tragedy, wasted lives, and death, that people recover. So this is the final poem. It's the final poem of the book. I think it's called Detachment. The things you love are still beautiful in the new dark they live in now. They're in their own stories, part of a larger plot you're too small to see the sense of. You can go on being unchanged yourself, still wrecking your hands and throwing out your back, trying to force open the window that's been stuck for ages, or you can give it up and sit still in the center of the room and just breathe and feel the grinding without trying to change it. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Kate, thank you so much. Such wonderful poems and such an important message for anyone who's come close to addiction, to hear the struggle, a family struggle to achieve recovery. I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Hello, my name is Bryn. Could I ask a question or, well, say something and then, so I'm a parent of, I'm still in the, my son's a meth addict and I'm still in the, okay, this is the new normal. Okay, no, now this is the new normal. And I find it very impossible to explain to people what that feels like. And I also think that there's this whole very superficial, shitty Hollywood version of that I think so, just so surfacey and Hallmark and I don't know. And I felt like the imagery that you use captured the kind of the thing that it is when you're a mother and your kid is like this. And then the other thing I wanted to know is, do you have something you want to say? And so you write the poem to say it, or do you want to write and then the poem shows you what it wants to say?
And, thank you for your comment and for asking a question. Are you asking me that about me or about what I think about people who write poetry in general?
About you personally.
I mean, I have stuff that I kind of have to say. I don't like write a poem because I have a public health message, though I'm aware that in many ways, as I talk about reading these poems and going around and reading them, that it sounds like I do. But I write because I mean, I'm one of those nerds who's been writing since I was 5. It was my delight as a kid to find out that this was this thing you could do. You could move words around in your head, you could put them on paper, and you would feel different after you did it. And So that's why I do. But I've been teaching creative writing to college students for 40 years. And the only one thing I can say about it is that people come to poetry writing in all different ways. And some people come because they have something they want to say, and other people come more like me because this is the only thing they can do. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Mhm.
yeah, you summed up really well that terrible feeling of being in the situation that you're in that's not stable, that's, what 12-step calls active using. And how do you keep a grip on yourself when it's someone you care about, and in the case of a child, are deeply attached to? And
Yes.
what 12-step, what Al-Anon, and I'm not asking if you go, we're supposed to remain anonymous, but it just saved my life, so I can't stay anonymous. But, it basically says what one of my friends said to me, who'd been through a version of this herself some years before my family entered it. She said, Kate, you can't let your life be destroyed by your child, no matter what. And that's what Al-Anon helped me to do, to remember that the first life I have responsibility to is mine. And in some ways, it's hard for mothers in particular, I think, because we give life and we're supposed to support it.
Yes. And that thing that you said about I don't remember the exact wording, but like him hurting you and you being like, but of course, he's my son.
Yeah.
That really
Yeah.
was a wonderful way to put that across.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a hard lesson to learn that may
Thank
not
you.
be the best thing to do,
Yeah. Thank you for sharing about
Thank
it.
you for coming. Thank you for talking.
A comment here. I'm a doctor. I'm a general internist, and I'm mostly retired now. But I work at the addiction clinic at the University of Virginia, and I give a copy of Kate's book to each resident or student who happens to show up that morning.
Thank you.
And for those of you who may have missed it, Dan is also a wonderful poet, and he's going to be our 5th speaker at the end of the month, reading from his new book, Second Chance.
Which is a wonderful book.
Kate, I have a question for you. Your poems are so evocative of emotion. And I wonder for you, when you're writing them and when you're reading them, do you get some sort of relief from the suffering that is the situation in the writing process or in sharing your work with others?
I think there is a kind of a relief. I think that all creative production, no matter how much artists want to deny it, it has some sort of therapeutic benefit. No matter how, making art in any form is hard. Writing poetry is hard. It doesn't seem like it would be hard, but it's really hard. And it's not always a lot of fun or relieving, or it doesn't feel therapeutic when you're doing it. But there is something about having done it, having made something, having sat with something and stayed with something and been committed to something to get it through this process that seems to me always healing in some way. That's not the point. We don't go to it to do that. Maybe most people don't, but we do it because we have to. What we do, but I don't know if that makes sense. After the fact, there's something that is a payoff. You're different afterwards. That whatever and especially if you write very autobiographically, like I do, and as you said, very, emotionally full of affect. There's something about that helps you manage it a little bit more. You don't feel the same. You feel differently. The experience is different, having spent all that time struggling with it.
Kate, I was wondering in that, maybe this is sort of related to that. whether you could say anything about form. How do you think about the form of your poems? And how does that connect to their content in this book?
So I think I said earlier, I started, writing poems when I was 5, and up until I went to college, everything I wrote was rhymed and metered. I probably sounded like a late 20th century, female child version of Longfellow. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. I mean, that's what I did. That's what you did. That was what the poems, that you mostly read, except for The Wasteland and Ginsberg's Howl. That's what they were like. So that's what you did.
Well, Kate, wasn't your one of your first books in the Victorian garden?
A Walk in Victoria's Secret.
Oh, in Victoria's Secret. Okay.
Pretty far from the Victorian garden. But when I got to college in the early 70s, I began to be exposed to a lot of contemporary poetry, it was like being let out of jail. And I never went back to writing in form. So I'm a completely committed free verse poet. There are what I consider to be formalistic elements in my poems. A lot of work with assonance, which is internal vowel recurrences in the interiors of words, certain types of internal rhyme. I have a sense of the line that I'm always working with, but nothing that's formally received. One of the things that's been interesting to me as a teacher of creative writing is if I try to force myself for some reason, I no longer do it, but I did for years, okay, well, why don't you write, a perfectly metrical villanelle? That'll be good for you. It'll be good discipline for you to do that. I feel just wild with unhappiness and a sense of oppression. And I don't like that feeling. And when I write in free verse without those, I feel liberated, imaginatively free. But what I've come to see is that poets who write in form, rhymed and metered in the received forms that we all know, sonnet, villanelle, sestina, blank verse, their imaginations are liberated by the very fact of working within these forms. So again, if I said the first thing I've learned about from teaching poetry is that people come to it in completely different ways. The second thing I've learned is that the exact same state that you need to be in order to write a poem, imaginative liberation with your linguistic tools close at hand, can be achieved by people like me who never write inside a form and want to kill all the forms, and then people who write in pretty much only in formal modes. It's an incredible thing about poetry. It's incredible.
It is. We almost have too much freedom. I just want to ask one more thing about that, which is, how do you think about a line? Like, how do you? What makes a line for you?
I don't think about a line until it's on the page. I just listen or something.
But I mean, when you're editing, when you're working on your work,
yeah,
what is it that makes it a line?
I mean, I can't say. I mean, it depends. The poems in these series that I read you all look kind of regular on the page. So I'm looking for a certain similarity of length, and typically similarity of stanzaic divisions and things like that. But that's not the only kind of poem I write. I write other kinds of poems as well that have that are not as involved with balance and symmetry. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that, even though I've been teaching creative writing for 40 years. Each poem announces itself in a different way, and I try to tend it. It feels like almost like gardening once I get a draft of it on the page. How am I going to neaten this up into whatever shape I want it to be in? And sometimes that shape is going to be neat, and other times it's going to be consciously not neat, if that makes sense. That's a bad answer. I'm sorry. I failed you. I'm sorry.
No, I understand.
There is another question. I'm not sure what to call you because there's 4 names there, but Virginia, Quinn, Bosch, Anthony, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
I do. First of all, I'm sorry I joined late, but Kate, I found every word of your poetry, gripping. Now, I'm a friend of Owen's. That's why I'm here. Love his poetry. But I couldn't help but think, this is so meaningful, and how to reach a bigger audience. A friend of mine who I've shared the information with is a very active member of AA. So shouldn't we all be reaching out to our friends to join this Thursday poetry readings?
Well, I mean, you
Please
know,
do.
yeah.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
But thank you for your kind words as well. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
So next week, we'll still be on the topic of addiction. I'll be presenting some of my own work from Best Man with a poet from Sheffield, Abby Wendler, whose book has just come out. And both of these books are about losing a brother to addiction. A little bit less of a happy ending than Kate's work, but also part of the story of addiction. So look forward to seeing you next week. And Kate, thank you so much. And Wendy, thank you so much for opening up the library in this wonderful way.
Well, I want to thank you, Owen, for the fantastic idea and the way you've orchestrated this for us. And Kate, thank you for sharing your work. It was really so powerful, and you had a deep effect on all of us. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Okay.
Thank
Night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Good to see everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice
Thank you
evening.
very
And if
much.
you'd like to revisit our session, please visit our YouTube channel for a recording.
Okay. Thank you so much for creating this. Appreciate it.